I don't talk about this much, but a few years ago, my friends and I went on a camping trip that still keeps me up at night. It happened in 2018, right after college, when a group of us decided to get away for a weekend. We had all graduated a few months earlier and everyone was either starting their first real job or in between things, so it seemed like the perfect time to escape. There were 5 of us in total, me, my 2 closest friends, Alex and Chris, and a couple of girls we had been hanging out with, Jenny and Rachel. We were all pretty familiar with camping. Nothing hardcore, but we'd done a fair bit over the years, and Chris was a big outdoorsy type, so we let him choose the spot. He found a place deep in the Catskill Mountains in New York. The area wasn't totally remote, but it was far enough from the usual campgrounds that we wouldn't run into many other people. It sounded like the perfect location. No crowds, no annoying tourists, just us and the woods. We left on a Friday afternoon in Chris's beat-up old SUV. It was one of those vehicles that looked like it had been on its last legs for a while, but Chris swore by it. We piled in with our gear and a cooler packed with snacks, beer, and some food for the weekend. The drive from the city was about 3 hours, and we made it to the trailhead in the early evening. From there, it was a couple of miles hike to the spot Chris had found online. He had checked it out on some backpacking forum and said it was supposed to be off the beaten path, but still accessible enough that we wouldn't be totally isolated if something went wrong. When we arrived at the trailhead, the parking lot was empty. The sun was already starting to set, but we were all in a good mood, excited to be out of the city and looking forward to a quiet weekend. We strapped on our backpacks and started down the trail. It was a little rougher than we expected, overgrown in places with some fallen trees blocking the path, but nothing too serious. We were all joking around and talking about how nice it was to finally get away from work, school, and all that stuff. It felt like we had the entire forest to ourselves. The hike to the campsite took about an hour and a half, and by the time we got there, it was already starting to get dark. The spot Chris had picked was perfect. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines with a little stream running nearby. We set up our tents, got a fire going, and settled in for the night. After a while, we were all just sitting around the campfire, drinking and telling stories. You know, the usual camping stuff. At some point, I thought I saw something move in the trees. It was just a quick flicker of motion out of the corner of my eye. But when I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something, so I didn't think much of it. We were in the middle of the woods after all. But after that, I noticed that the atmosphere around the campfire had changed a bit. Everyone got a little quieter, and the laughter died down. It wasn't like anyone said anything, but we were all a little on edge. We stayed up for a while longer, but eventually, we decided to call it a night. We split off into our tents. Alex and I shared one, while Chris, Jenny, and Rachel each had their own. It was a tight fit with 2 people, but I didn't mind. I always preferred camping with someone else in the tent. It just felt safer that way. That first night, I slept like crap. I kept waking up to the sound of rustling outside the tent. Every time I opened my eyes, I'd strain my ears, trying to figure out if it was the wind or an animal. But it was hard to tell. At one point, I could have sworn I heard footsteps, like someone walking through the underbrush just beyond the campsite. But every time I listened closely, the sound would stop. After a while, I convinced myself I was just being paranoid, and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, everyone seemed a little groggy. I could tell I wasn't the only one who hadn't slept well. Chris asked if anyone else had heard noises during the night, and a couple of us nodded. Rachel said she thought she heard something walking around the camp, but she figured it was just one of us going to the bathroom or something. We shrugged it off and chalked it up to the usual weird noises you hear in the woods. The day went by without anything unusual happening. We spent most of it hiking around the area, exploring some of the old logging roads and trails that crisscrossed the forest. It was a beautiful day, and the woods were peaceful, but I couldn't shake a weird feeling. There was something about the area that felt off. The deeper we went into the forest, the more it felt like we were being watched, not by an animal or anything, but by something more aware. When we got back to camp in the late afternoon, we found a set of footprints in the dirt near the edge of the clearing. They were faint but unmistakable, too large to be one of ours, and they led away into the trees. Chris said they were probably from another hiker or hunter passing through, but none of us had seen anyone all day. The nearest trailhead was miles away, and we hadn't noticed any other cars parked there when we arrived. Still, we brushed it off and didn't let it ruin the evening. We cooked dinner over the fire and tried to relax, but that night I felt more uneasy than before. When I crawled into my sleeping bag, I made sure to keep my knife within reach, just in case. I wasn't really expecting anything to happen, but it made me feel a little better. As I lay there staring up at the ceiling of the tent, I heard the rustling start again. This time it was louder, closer. It wasn't the wind, it was definitely footsteps moving around the perimeter of our campsite. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Whoever, or whatever it was, they were circling us, moving from tent to tent. The footsteps would stop for a few seconds, then start up again. It was like they were trying to be quiet, but not quite succeeding. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then, for a few long minutes, everything went silent. I was about to close my eyes when I heard something that made my blood run cold. The unmistakable sound of a zipper being pulled open. It was faint, but I was sure of it. Someone, or something, was trying to get into one of the tents. I sat up, gripping my knife tightly, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I wake up Alex? Should I go out and confront whoever it was? My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would wake him up, but he was still snoring softly next to me. The zipper sound stopped, and after a few moments of tense silence, I heard the footsteps again, moving away from the tent and disappearing into the woods. I stayed awake for hours, too scared to fall asleep, but nothing else happened that night. The next morning, I told the others what I'd heard, but no one else had noticed anything unusual. We checked the tents, but there was no sign of anyone trying to get in. The footprints from the day before were still there, though, and they seemed to lead deeper into the forest. Chris suggested that maybe we were just freaking ourselves out, but I could tell he was starting to get uneasy too. We all were. That day, we stuck closer to camp, not feeling much like exploring. Every now and then, I'd catch Alex or Jenny glancing nervously at the trees, as if expecting someone or something to appear. By late afternoon, we were all on edge, so we decided to have an early dinner and go to bed early, hoping to get a better night's sleep. That night, I woke up again to the sound of footsteps. This time they were closer. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to hide anymore. The steps were heavy and deliberate, like someone was walking in circles around the tents. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening. The footsteps would pause occasionally, then start up again. I heard something brush against the side of the tent, and my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. The steps continued for what felt like hours, but eventually, they faded away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, we found more footprints around the campsite. This time, they were everywhere, around the tents, near the fire pit, even by the stream. Whoever, or whatever, had been out there had come very close, and one of our knives, which we'd left out on the picnic table, was missing. That was enough for us. We packed up our gear as quickly as possible and left the campsite. The hike back to the trailhead was tense and silent. None of us wanted to admit how freaked out we were, but it was clear that we all felt the same way. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made us jump. When we finally reached the SUV, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. We loaded our gear into the back and drove off without saying much. The ride back to the city was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. It was late summer in 2019. I remember it clearly because it was the last time our group went on our yearly camping trip. There were 4 of us, me, my best friends Dylan and Steve, and our other close friend Mark. The 4 of us had been tight since middle school, and we tried to keep up the tradition of camping together at least once a year. This time, we chose a spot near the Delaware Water Gap, a remote area by the river. We'd been to the general area before, but we decided to explore a more secluded part of the woods to make it a little more interesting. Steve found a spot near a bend in the river that was supposed to be perfect for camping, off the beaten path and far from the more crowded areas. The drive up from New York City took about 2 hours, and we got there around midday. It was hot as hell that weekend, and we were all sweaty and tired by the time we reached the parking lot near the trailhead. From there, it was about a 45-minute hike to the spot. We loaded up our gear, grabbed our packs, and set off down the trail. The hike was pretty straightforward at first, but after about 30 minutes, we turned off the main trail and followed a smaller, less defined path that wound through the woods and toward the river. There were no signs, no markers, just a narrow, overgrown trail that Steve had found on some online forum. He was always the one to find these kinds of out-of-the-way spots. We finally made it to the riverbank and found a flat area to set up camp. It was a great spot, totally secluded, with the sound of the river in the background and a decent clearing where we could put up our tents. We spent the next hour or so getting everything set up: 2 tents, a small fire pit, and a place to hang our food to keep it away from animals. Once camp was set, we cracked open some beers and sat by the river, relaxing and enjoying the late afternoon sun. Everything was normal. We joked around, talked about work and life, and planned out the hikes we wanted to do over the next couple of days. The first night was uneventful. We stayed up late by the fire, drank a little too much, and eventually crashed in our tents. I shared one tent with Dylan, and Steve and Mark had their own. I slept like a rock, which is pretty typical for me when I'm camping. Nothing bothered me that night. The second day was more of the same. We went for a long hike, exploring some of the nearby trails, then came back to camp in the late afternoon to cool off in the river. It was brutally hot, so we spent a lot of time just sitting in the water, trying to stay cool. I remember feeling tired but content, just enjoying the peace and quiet with my friends. That night, things started to feel off. It was around midnight when Mark got up to go to the bathroom. I was half asleep at the time, but I heard him unzip his tent and shuffle out. Dylan was already snoring beside me, and I figured Mark was just stepping out to relieve himself like we all did at some point during the night. Nothing unusual. I must have fallen back asleep after that, but when I woke up again, it was still dark. I could hear the river flowing in the distance, but something else was off. The camp felt too quiet. I turned over and checked my phone. No signal, but it was around 2 a.m. Mark hadn't come back yet. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I lay there, I started to get this weird feeling in my gut. He'd been gone for a while. Maybe he was just out by the river, cooling off or enjoying the night. It wasn't that strange, I told myself. I tried to fall back asleep, but I couldn't. There was this weird tension in the air, like something wasn't right. I figured I'd just get up, check on Mark, and make sure everything was okay. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could so I wouldn't wake Dylan. The fire had died down to embers and the campsite was bathed in faint moonlight. I looked around, but there was no sign of Mark. His tent was still open from when he left, and his flashlight was gone, so I assumed he'd taken it with him. I walked over to the edge of the camp and called out for him. Nothing. No response. The river wasn't far, so I figured he might have gone down there. I grabbed my own flashlight and headed toward the water, calling his name as I went. Still nothing. By the time I reached the riverbank, I was starting to get worried. There was no sign of him, and it was pitch black beyond the beam of my flashlight. I shined the light around, but the only thing I could see was the water reflecting back at me. I called out again, louder this time, but there was no answer. I stood there for a minute, listening. The woods were completely still. I don't know how to explain it, but in that moment I had this sinking feeling that something was really wrong. I headed back to camp and woke Dylan up. I hated to do it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark should have been back by now. Dylan groggily sat up, and when I told him what was going on, he immediately looked concerned. We grabbed Steve, and the three of us started searching around the camp, calling for Mark and shining our flashlights into the trees. We figured he might have wandered off to explore, or maybe even gotten lost in the dark. But no matter how much we yelled, there was no sign of him. It was like he had just disappeared. After about an hour of searching, we regrouped at the camp. It was close to 3:30 a.m. by then, and we were starting to get really worried. We knew Mark wouldn't have just wandered off like that without telling someone. He wasn't the type to mess around or play pranks, and he definitely wouldn't have left the camp for hours in the middle of the night without a word. Dylan suggested we wait until daylight to search more thoroughly. Maybe Mark had just gotten lost in the dark, and we'd be able to find him once the sun came up. Reluctantly, we agreed. It wasn't like we had much of a choice. We didn't have cell service, and hiking out in the middle of the night would have been dangerous. We stayed up the rest of the night, sitting around the campfire and keeping watch. No one said much. We were all worried sick, and the silence felt oppressive. Every little noise from the woods made me jump, and I couldn't stop thinking about where Mark could be. The whole situation just didn't make sense. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, we started searching again. We spread out in different directions, calling Mark's name and checking every possible place he could have gone. We combed through the area by the river, walked up and down the trail, and searched the woods around the camp, but there was no trace of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. After a couple of hours, we knew we had to go get help. There was no way we could keep searching on our own, and the longer we waited, the worse the situation was getting. We packed up some essentials, left most of our gear at the camp, and hiked back to the trailhead as fast as we could. The whole way, I kept hoping we'd find Mark on the trail. Maybe he'd gotten lost and found his way back, or maybe we'd missed him in the dark, but we didn't see a single sign of him. When we finally got back to the parking lot, we drove straight to the nearest ranger station. It was about a 30-minute drive, but it felt like an eternity. My mind was racing with all kinds of horrible possibilities. What if he had fallen into the river? What if he'd gotten injured and couldn't make his way back? Or worse, what if someone else had found him out there? The Rangers took us seriously right away, which was a relief. They organized a search party and sent us back to the camp to wait while they combed the area. By this point, it was mid-afternoon, and we were all exhausted. I could tell Steve was trying to stay hopeful, but Dylan was starting to crack. We sat around the fire pit, barely speaking, just staring into the trees, waiting for someone to bring us news. The search went on for the rest of the day and into the night, but there was no sign of Mark. No footprints, no clothing, nothing. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The Rangers said they'd keep searching, but as the hours dragged on, I felt a growing sense of dread. This wasn't normal. People didn't just disappear like that without a trace. Over the next couple of days, the search intensified. More rangers, volunteers, and even dogs were brought in to help. We stayed nearby, waiting for any news, but each day ended with the same result: nothing. Mark was just gone. I don't know how else to describe it. The longer the search went on, the more hopeless it felt. Eventually, the Rangers told us they were scaling back the search. There was only so much they could do, and without any leads, they couldn't keep looking indefinitely. We were devastated. It felt like we were leaving him behind, abandoning him out there in the woods. A few weeks later, Mark's torn-up backpack was found deep in the forest, far from where we had camped. The area had already been searched multiple times, but somehow the backpack had gone unnoticed. There was no sign of Mark, no clues about what had happened to him, just his backpack, weathered and torn like it had been out there for months. To this day, I don't know what happened to Mark. No one does. He was officially declared a missing person, and the case is still open, but there have been no new developments. It's like he just walked into the woods and disappeared. Back in 2017, my dad and I took a camping trip that I'll never forget. It was meant to be a simple father-son bonding thing, something we hadn't done in a long time. Dad had been talking about getting away from the city for months, and I had just started a new job, so I figured a weekend in the woods might be a good way to unwind. We decided to head to the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania, a place my dad used to visit when he was younger. He had all these great memories of camping there with his brothers, and I think he wanted to recreate that with me. We packed up the car on a Friday morning, brought all the usual camping gear, tent, sleeping bags, coolers full of food, and hit the road. It was about a 3-hour drive from Pittsburgh, where we live, to the edge of the forest. The further we got from the city, the more relaxed we both felt. The stress of work and everyday life started to fade, and we were just focused on the trip ahead. By the time we arrived at the forest, it was early afternoon. The place was beautiful, just as my dad had described. Towering trees, a thick blanket of green everywhere, and the sound of birds and the occasional rustling of leaves. It was perfect. We found a secluded spot to set up camp, a little ways off one of the less traveled roads, so we knew we wouldn't be bothered by other campers. The area we picked was flat, with plenty of space for our tent, and there was a small clearing not far from a stream where we could get water if we needed it. Everything felt ideal. Setting up camp was easy enough, and before long we had a fire going, the tent pitched, and our gear all organized. My dad was in a great mood, telling me stories about his old camping trips while we sat around the fire, cooking hot dogs and drinking a couple of beers. It felt good to be out there, away from everything. There was a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time, like the kind you can only find deep in the woods. Later that evening, after the sun went down, we sat by the fire and just enjoyed the quiet. The forest around us was dark, but the stars were out in full force, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional chirp of crickets. After a while, though, I thought I heard something else. Voices. At first, I wasn't sure if it was just the wind, but then I realized it definitely sounded like people talking, faint and distant, but unmistakable. I didn't say anything at first, thinking maybe there were other campers nearby, but after a while, the voices seemed to get a little louder, still faint but closer. My dad must have heard it too, because he stopped talking mid-sentence and looked around. We both just sat there for a minute, listening. It was hard to pinpoint exactly where the voices were coming from, but they seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper in the woods, behind us. The weird thing was, we hadn't seen anyone else all day, not even on the drive in, and this part of the forest was pretty remote. We brushed it off though, thinking maybe there were some hikers nearby or something. It wasn't like we were in the middle of nowhere, just a quiet part of the forest. Still, I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. We went to bed not long after that, figuring we'd get an early start in the morning for a day of hiking. I didn't sleep great that night. The forest was quieter than I expected. No animals rustling around, no sounds of movement, just dead silence. The only sound I could hear was my dad's light snoring next to me. Around midnight, though, I woke up to the sound of those voices again, only this time they were much closer. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening. It was definitely people talking, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. It was just this low, murmuring sound, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. I sat up in the tent, trying to figure out what was going on. My first thought was that maybe some other campers had set up nearby after we'd gone to bed, but the voices weren't coming from any specific direction. They seemed to be moving around, circling the camp, sometimes close, sometimes farther away. I poked my dad and he woke up groggily. I told him I could hear people, and he sat up, listening. After a minute or two, he nodded, clearly hearing it too. He grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cool night air. I followed him out and we stood by the fire pit, shining our flashlights into the trees, but we didn't see anything. The voices had stopped. We stood there for a while, waiting, but nothing happened. The woods were silent again. My dad shrugged it off, saying it was probably just some hikers passing through, maybe talking as they walked, and their voices carried through the trees. It made sense, I guess, but it still felt off. Why would anyone be hiking that late? And why hadn't we seen any signs of them? We eventually went back to bed, but I didn't sleep much. I kept listening for the voices to come back, but they didn't. The rest of the night passed without incident, and by morning, the weirdness of the night before seemed like a distant memory. My dad didn't mention it, and I didn't feel like bringing it up, so we just carried on with our plans. We spent most of the day hiking some of the trails nearby, exploring the forest and checking out some of the old logging roads that crisscrossed the area. It was a beautiful day, warm and sunny, and I started to forget about the strange events of the night before. By the time we got back to camp in the late afternoon, we were both tired but in good spirits. We made dinner, sat around the fire again, and talked for a while, but the atmosphere felt different. I couldn't shake this creeping sense of unease, like we weren't as alone as we thought. That night, after we'd turned in for bed, the voices came back. This time they were louder, clearer. I could hear distinct words, but they were still too jumbled to understand. It sounded like multiple people talking, their voices low but urgent, like they were having an argument or something. I sat up in my sleeping bag again, my heart pounding. This wasn't normal. There was no way it was just hikers. I poked my dad awake, and this time he didn't brush it off. He grabbed his flashlight again, and we both got out of the tent. The air outside was cool, and the fire had died down to embers. We stood there listening. The voices were definitely coming from the woods, but just like the night before, they seemed to move around, never staying in one spot long enough to figure out where they were coming from. My dad was visibly uneasy now, and I could tell he didn't have an explanation. We started walking toward the edge of the camp, shining our flashlights into the trees, but there was nothing there. No movement, no shadows, just the dark, quiet forest. The voices stopped as soon as we stepped out of the tent, leaving only the sound of the wind in the trees. We spent a long time standing there listening, but the voices didn't come back. My dad muttered something about calling it a night and headed back to the tent. I followed, but I didn't feel any better. Something wasn't right, but there was nothing we could do about it. We were miles from the nearest town, and we hadn't seen a single person since we'd arrived. I barely slept that night, every rustle of the wind making me jump. But somehow, we made it through to morning. My dad and I didn't talk much as we packed up camp that day. There was this unspoken tension between us, like we both knew something was wrong, but neither of us wanted to admit it. We decided to cut the trip short and head back home a day early. We didn't even bother cooking breakfast. We just packed up our gear and left. As we hiked back to the car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following us, but the trail was empty. We didn't run into anyone on the way out, just the quiet, empty woods. By the time we got back to the car, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief. I didn't realize just how tense I had been the entire time until we were driving out of the forest, the trees slowly giving way to open roads and towns. On the drive home, we didn't say much. My dad tried to lighten the mood, cracking a few jokes, but I could tell he was shaken too. Whatever had been out there, it wasn't normal, and we both knew it. In the fall of 2017, I went on a camping trip with my best friend Nate that I still think about all the time. It's not the kind of thing I like to talk about, but every now and then, I'll hear something that reminds me of that weekend, and I feel this sinking pit in my stomach all over again. We were both in our mid-20s at the time, and Nate was a huge outdoors guy, way more than I was. He was always pushing me to go camping, hiking, or fishing, and while I liked the outdoors, I wasn't as obsessed with it as he was. But I figured, what the hell, it's only one weekend and I hadn't done anything adventurous in a while. So, when Nate suggested we head out to the Adirondacks for a long weekend of camping and hunting, I agreed. Nate had just gotten his hunting license, and he was excited to finally put it to use. I wasn't as into the hunting part, but I didn't mind tagging along for the camping and hiking. We packed up Nate's truck on a Friday afternoon, leaving from our place in Albany. It was a pretty easy drive, about 3 hours, and the scenery was beautiful. The leaves were starting to change, and the weather was perfect. Crisp, but not too cold. We planned to camp for 2 nights, maybe 3, depending on how things went. Nate had chosen a spot near Indian Lake, deep in the forest, but not too far from a popular hiking trail. We weren't expecting to be totally isolated, but the area was far enough off the beaten path that we wouldn't be surrounded by other campers. By the time we reached the trailhead, it was late afternoon, and the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. We parked Nate's truck in the gravel lot and hiked about 2 miles in, lugging all our gear with us. The spot Nate had picked was pretty secluded, a small clearing surrounded by dense forest on all sides. There wasn't much of a trail to the campsite itself, just a rough path that seemed like it hadn't been used in a while. We set up our tent, got a fire going, and made a quick dinner before it got too dark. Everything felt pretty normal, quiet, peaceful, the kind of relaxing vibe you hope for when you go camping. We sat around the fire for a while talking about work, life, whatever, and eventually we decided to call it a night. Now, I'm not one of those people who jumps at every sound in the woods, but I'll admit I don't sleep great when I'm camping. There's something about being out in the open that keeps me on edge, and that night was no different. I woke up a few times, hearing the usual noises, branches snapping, animals rustling around, stuff like that. Nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. Nate was snoring away next to me, totally unbothered by any of it, and I figured if he wasn't worried, I didn't need to be either. The next day, we got up early and headed out for a hike, scouting the area for any signs of game. Nate was all geared up for hunting, his rifle slung over his shoulder, while I mostly tagged along for the exercise and fresh air. We spent a good chunk of the day hiking through the woods, stopping now and then when Nate thought he spotted something worth tracking, but we didn't have much luck. By late afternoon, we decided to head back to camp and take it easy for the rest of the day. When we got back to the campsite, though, something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was this weird tension in the air, like the kind you get when someone's been in your space when you weren't there. I looked around the camp, but nothing seemed out of place. Our gear was where we'd left it, the fire pit was untouched, and everything seemed normal. Nate didn't notice anything, or if he did, he didn't say anything about it, so I brushed it off as me being paranoid. We spent the rest of the afternoon sitting around the fire, drinking beers and cooking dinner. As the sun started to set, I noticed that the forest around us was getting eerily quiet. The usual sounds of birds, insects, and rustling leaves seemed to fade away, leaving just the crackling of the fire and the occasional gust of wind. I mentioned it to Nate, but he shrugged it off, saying the woods just get quiet sometimes. I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting, so I dropped it. That night, I woke up to the sound of gunshots. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again. 2 quick pops, close enough that I could feel the vibration in my chest. I shot up in my sleeping bag, my heart racing. Nate was already awake, sitting up in the tent with his rifle in his hands. His face was pale, and I could tell he was freaked out too. We sat there in the dark for a minute, listening. The gunshots had stopped, but there was this strange stillness outside the tent, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know what. Nate finally unzipped the tent and stepped outside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. I followed him, and we both stood there in the clearing looking around. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim orange glow across the campsite, but nothing seemed out of place. We stood there for a few minutes waiting, but the gunshots didn't come again. There was no sign of anyone else nearby, no lights, no movement, just the dark, silent woods. Nate muttered something about hunters, maybe firing off a few shots at game and we should just get some sleep. I wanted to believe that, but it didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been anyone that close to us, not in the middle of the night. And whoever it was, they had fired those shots way too close to our camp for comfort. Still, there wasn't much else we could do, so we went back to the tent and tried to sleep. I didn't get much rest after that. Every little noise outside made me jump, and I kept waiting for the sound of gunshots to come again. But the rest of the night passed without incident, and by morning, I almost convinced myself it wasn't a big deal. The next day, though, things got worse. Nate wanted to head out and hunt again, but I wasn't feeling it. I told him I'd stay at camp and keep an eye on things while he went out. He didn't seem too bothered by it and took off after breakfast, leaving me alone at the campsite. I spent most of the morning just hanging out, reading, and trying to relax, but I couldn't shake this creeping sense of unease. It was like the whole forest was watching me, waiting for something to happen. I kept glancing around, checking the trees for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the same stillness that had been bothering me since the night before. Around noon, I started hearing the gunshots again. This time they were farther away, but still close enough that I could hear them clearly. I stood up, listening. They weren't the same kind of shots you'd expect from someone hunting game. Too rapid, too irregular. It sounded more like someone was firing aimlessly, almost recklessly. I grabbed my phone and tried to call Nate, but of course there was no signal out there. I waited for a few minutes, hoping the shots would stop, but they kept going, echoing through the trees. I couldn't just sit there anymore. I packed up some of our gear just in case and started walking in the direction Nate had gone, hoping I'd find him before anything happened. I didn't have to walk far before I found him. He was standing at the edge of a clearing, his rifle slung over his shoulder, staring off into the distance. I called out to him, but he didn't respond at first. When I got closer, I saw why. There was a deer lying on the ground in front of him, dead. But something wasn't right. It had been shot, but not cleanly. There were multiple bullet wounds in its body, and the way it was lying there, half sprawled out, it didn't look like a normal kill. Nate turned to me, his face pale. He muttered something about how he didn't fire those shots, that the deer had already been dead when he got there. I could see the confusion in his eyes, but more than that, I could see the fear. This wasn't just some hunting accident. We both stood there for a while, trying to make sense of it. Whoever had fired those shots had been close, too close. Nate hadn't heard or seen anyone, but the way the deer was shot up made it clear that whoever had done this wasn't just hunting. It felt intentional, like a warning. We didn't say much after that. We walked back to camp, packed up our gear as quickly as we could, and got the hell out of there. The whole hike back to the truck, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following us. But the woods were empty. Silent. The only sound was our own footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. When we finally got back to the truck and drove out of the forest, I felt this overwhelming sense of relief, like we'd narrowly escaped something terrible. I didn't know what exactly, but I knew we weren't supposed to be there. Something or someone wanted us gone, and they weren't afraid to make that clear. We didn't talk much on the drive home. Nate kept saying it was probably just some drunk hunters messing around, that we were overreacting, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Neither did I. There was something off about the whole thing, something I couldn't explain. I haven't been back to the Adirondacks since, and I doubt I ever will. It was the summer of 2019 when a group of friends and I took a camping trip that still keeps me up some nights. There were 6 of us on the trip: me, my 2 closest friends, Matt and James, and 3 others, Emma, Claire, and Ben, who I knew from college but wasn't as close with. We all lived in upstate New York, and that summer, we decided to get away for a long weekend of camping and hiking in the Adirondacks. It was something we'd been planning for a while, and we were all excited to disconnect from the world for a bit and just enjoy nature. Matt had picked a spot that was pretty remote, deep in the woods near a place called Cranberry Lake. It wasn't a well-known campsite, which was perfect because we didn't want to deal with crowds. We were all pretty comfortable with camping, so the isolation didn't bother us. In fact, we were looking forward to being far away from everything. We drove up on a Friday afternoon, loaded up with gear and supplies. The drive from Albany took about 3 hours, and the last stretch was on a narrow, winding dirt road that seemed to go on forever. By the time we got to the trailhead, it was already late afternoon. We hiked about 2 miles into the woods, far enough that we wouldn't be bothered by anyone, and set up camp in a small clearing near the lake. The area was beautiful: tall trees, a clear view of the water, and no other signs of human life. It felt like we had the entire forest to ourselves. The first night was uneventful. We made a fire, cooked some food, and just hung out around the campfire, laughing and talking. Everything was normal. After a while, we called it a night and crawled into our tents. Matt and I shared a tent, James and Ben were in another, and the girls had their own tent. I didn't sleep that well, which isn't unusual for me when I'm camping. The forest at night always feels different, darker, quieter. Every sound is amplified. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside the tent. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or deer, so I didn't think much of it. But when I looked through the mesh window of the tent, I saw something strange. Off in the distance, maybe 50 or 60 yards away, there was a small light moving through the trees. It looked like a flashlight, but it was faint and moving slowly, almost deliberately. I watched it for a while, trying to figure out what it was. At first, I thought maybe it was another camper, but we hadn't seen anyone else out there, and it didn't make sense for someone to be wandering around the woods at that hour, especially without making any noise. The light didn't seem to be getting closer, so I eventually brushed it off and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I mentioned the light to Matt, but he didn't seem too concerned. He joked that maybe it was a park ranger or something checking the area. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I let it go. We spent the day hiking, exploring the area, and swimming in the lake. It was a good day, and by the time we got back to camp in the late afternoon, I had mostly forgotten about the light. That night, though, the light came back. We were all sitting around the fire talking when Emma suddenly pointed toward the woods. We all turned to look, and there it was, another light moving through the trees. This time it was closer than the night before, and it was moving more slowly, like someone was deliberately walking through the forest with a flashlight. We all stared at it for a few seconds, unsure of what to think. Ben yelled out into the woods, asking if someone was there, but there was no response. The light kept moving, weaving between the trees, but it never came closer. After a few minutes, it disappeared, just blinked out like it had never been there. We all sat there in silence for a while, trying to make sense of it. James suggested that maybe it was someone camping nearby, but we hadn't seen any other tents or heard anyone else in the area. It didn't make sense for someone to be out there wandering around without making any noise. Still, we tried to brush it off and went back to talking, though the mood had definitely shifted. We were all a little on edge, but none of us wanted to admit it. We went to bed a little earlier that night, and I made sure to keep my flashlight and knife next to me just in case. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I didn't want to take any chances. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. This time it wasn't because of a noise. I just had this sudden feeling that something was wrong. I lay there for a minute, listening to the sounds of the forest, but everything seemed quiet. I was about to close my eyes and go back to sleep when I saw it again, the light. But this time, it was much closer. I could see it moving through the trees, maybe 20 or 30 yards from the tent. It was the same faint, slow-moving light as before, but now it was right on the edge of our camp. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to wake Matt, but I didn't want to make any noise. I just lay there, staring at the light, my heart racing. It moved around the edge of the camp, circling us, but it never came any closer. After what felt like forever, it disappeared again. The next morning, I told everyone what I'd seen, and this time, no one laughed it off. We all agreed that something weird was going on, but none of us wanted to leave. We were in the middle of nowhere, and the thought of hiking out in the dark didn't seem any better than staying. So we decided to stick it out for one more night. That evening, we built the fire up bigger than before, hoping it would keep whatever, or whoever, was out there at bay. We stayed close to the fire, not straying too far from camp. By the time the sun went down, the tension was thick. We were all waiting for the light to come back. And it did. Just after dark, Emma saw it first. The light was back, moving through the trees, but this time there were two of them. Two faint lights, circling the camp from opposite sides. They moved slowly, almost deliberately, like they were checking us out, seeing how we'd react.
Ben and James stood up, shouting into the woods, but there was no response. The lights kept moving, never getting too close, just circling. I could tell everyone was scared now. The joking had stopped and no one knew what to do. We all just stood there, staring at the lights, trying to figure out what was going on. After a few minutes, the lights disappeared again, just like they had the nights before. We sat around the fire, talking in hushed voices, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was a prank, someone messing with us. But how would they know we were out here? We hadn't seen anyone else in days, and there was no reason for anyone to be out there in the middle of the night, miles away from the nearest road. As the night wore on, we all agreed that we'd leave first thing in the morning. None of us wanted to stay another night in that camp, not with those lights out there. We didn't know what was going on, but it was clear that we weren't alone. We barely slept that night. Every little sound had us on edge, and I kept expecting to see the lights again, but they didn't come back. By the time morning finally came, we were all exhausted, but we packed up camp as quickly as we could and started hiking out. The whole hike back, I felt like we were being watched. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I half expected to see someone following us, but there was nothing. Just the quiet, empty woods. We made it back to the trailhead without incident, and as soon as we got to the car, we loaded up and drove out of there as fast as we could. No one talked much on the drive back. We were all too freaked out by what had happened. I still don't know what those lights were. Maybe it was someone messing with us. Maybe it was something else. But whatever it was, it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like a harmless prank or a coincidence. It felt deliberate, like we were being watched, maybe even hunted. I haven't been back to that part of the Adirondacks since, and I doubt I ever will. Something about that place wasn't right, and I'm not willing to find out what it was. All I know is that we were lucky to get out of there when we did. If we'd stayed another night, I'm not sure we would have been so lucky.
A few years ago, I went hiking with a close friend of mine in the Olympic National Forest in Washington. Both of us had been hiking for years and were always looking for new trails to explore. And this particular weekend, we decided to push it a bit further and camp off trail in a more remote area. We'd heard about the beauty of the Olympic Peninsula and how much there was to see off the beaten path. So we figured we'd make a weekend out of it, with 2 days of hiking and 1 night of camping in the middle of nowhere. We planned everything out meticulously, packed the usual supplies, tent, sleeping bags, food, water, GPS, all the essentials. Our trailhead was at a spot called Staircase, a less traveled area of the national park. There were a few other people around when we parked and started out, but the deeper we went, the quieter it got. It didn't take long for us to leave everyone behind. The first part of the hike was great. We were making good time, covering ground, and it felt amazing to be out there, just the two of us, far away from the noise of everyday life. The forest out there is dense and humid, with towering old-growth trees, thick moss, and underbrush everywhere. It felt wild. That was part of the thrill, knowing we were really off the map. After a full day of hiking, we set up camp in a small clearing we found. It wasn't a typical campsite, obviously, since we were off trail, but it worked for what we needed. We made a fire, cooked up some dinner, and sat back to relax as the sun started to dip below the horizon. There's something about being out there with no one else around that makes you feel like you're in your own little world. It got dark fast. That's one thing about the forest. Once the sun's down, the trees swallow up the last bit of light and it's pitch black. We weren't too worried, though. We'd both camped in remote areas before, and this felt like any other night out in the woods. We stayed up for a while, chatting and listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind through the trees, the occasional snap of a branch. Nothing out of the ordinary. When we finally decided to crash, it must have been close to midnight. At some point during the night, I woke up. I didn't know what time it was, but it was still completely dark. There wasn't any sound outside, at least not at first. I figured it was just one of those moments when you randomly wake up during the night for no reason, so I closed my eyes and tried to get back to sleep. That's when I heard it. A voice. A woman's voice calling out from somewhere in the distance. At first it was faint, barely audible, but then it called out again, a little louder this time. It sounded like she was asking for help. I sat up, trying to shake off the grogginess and listen. The voice was coming from deeper in the woods, away from the direction we had hiked. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I was confused, trying to make sense of it. It was late at night in the middle of nowhere, and I couldn't figure out why someone would be out there, let alone calling for help. I nudged my friend awake and told him what I'd heard. At first, he thought I was hearing things, or maybe it was an animal making noise, but then we both heard it again. This time it was unmistakable. A woman's voice, clear and desperate, calling for help. We both grabbed our headlamps, threw on our boots, and stepped out of the tent. We scanned the woods in the direction the voice was coming from, but it was so dark that our lights barely penetrated the trees. The voice called out again, a little more urgent now. Neither of us knew what to do. On the one hand, it was possible that someone was out there, hurt or lost and needed help. But on the other hand, we were in a remote part of the forest, far off trail, and it didn't make sense that anyone would be out here, especially alone, in the middle of the night. My friend suggested that we wait and listen for a while, see if the voice got any closer, but it stayed about the same distance away, calling out sporadically, always the same, asking for help.
After a few minutes, we decided to grab our gear and head in the direction of the voice. It felt wrong to just ignore it, and we couldn't shake the feeling that someone might really be in trouble. We grabbed a couple of flashlights, our GPS, and some water, then headed into the trees. As we moved deeper into the woods, the voice would call out every so often, leading us further and further from our campsite. The terrain got more difficult to navigate, with thick brush and uneven ground slowing us down. Every now and then, we'd stop to listen, but the voice never got much closer or much farther away. It was always just out of reach. After what felt like an hour of walking, we started to get frustrated. The voice wasn't leading us anywhere, it just kept calling out, but no matter how far we went, we couldn't seem to get any closer. My friend suggested we turn back. We were already far from our camp, and it didn't feel like we were making any progress. But just as we were about to turn around, the voice called out again, sounding closer this time. We pressed on, feeling like we were finally getting somewhere. The voice kept coming, but now it sounded off, like it was repeating the same tone and inflection over and over, as if it wasn't a real person but some kind of recording on a loop. That's when the unease really started to set in. We both stopped, exchanging a nervous glance. It didn't make sense. Suddenly there was silence. The voice stopped completely, and the forest was eerily quiet. We stood there for a minute, straining our ears, but there was nothing. No wind, no animals, just dead silence. That's when my friend muttered something about heading back, and I agreed. Whatever was going on, we didn't want to be a part of it anymore. We turned around and started making our way back toward the camp. But the problem was, we'd been so focused on following the voice that we hadn't been paying attention to where we were going. The forest looked different at night, and nothing seemed familiar. We tried using the GPS, but it was acting up, like the signal was weak or something. We had no idea where we were. For the next couple of hours, we stumbled through the forest, trying to find our way back to camp. Every now and then, we'd stop and listen, hoping to hear something that would guide us in the right direction. But the voice was gone. The forest was as silent as ever. By the time we finally stumbled back into the clearing where our camp was, it was almost dawn. We were exhausted, drenched in sweat, and still shaken by the whole experience. We packed up our gear as quickly as we could and started the hike back to the trailhead. When we finally made it back to the car, we were both too tired to talk about what had happened. We just got in and drove, leaving the forest behind us. It wasn't until we stopped at a small town nearby to grab something to eat that we started to process what had happened. We walked into a small diner and sat down, still feeling on edge. As we were waiting for our food, my friend noticed a flyer pinned up on the bulletin board by the door. It was a missing persons notice, a woman who had disappeared in the area a few months earlier. She'd gone missing while hiking in the national park, and no one had seen or heard from her since.
Back in the fall of 2018, I decided to take a solo camping trip to clear my head. I was going through a rough patch. Work was stressing me out, my relationship at the time was falling apart, and I just needed a break. I'd always enjoyed being outdoors, and a few days of peace and quiet in the wilderness seemed like the perfect reset. I didn't tell too many people where I was going, just a couple of close friends, in case something went wrong. I chose a spot in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. It's not too far from where I live, maybe about a 3-hour drive from Pittsburgh. The area I picked was pretty remote, but that's what I wanted. There are a few campgrounds around there, but I planned to set up in a more isolated area, off one of the lesser-known trails. I figured I wouldn't run into many people, which was the whole point. Just me, nature, and a few days of solitude. I packed light, just my tent, a sleeping bag, a couple of days' worth of food, and the basics for survival. I wasn't planning on doing much except reading, hiking, and maybe fishing at one of the nearby lakes. I've camped plenty of times before, both with friends and solo, so I wasn't too worried about being out there alone. I've always been pretty comfortable in the woods. The first day went exactly as I'd hoped. I arrived at the trailhead in the early afternoon, parked the car, and hiked about 2 miles to a spot I'd scoped out online. It was a small clearing near a creek, surrounded by trees on all sides. No sign of anyone else, just the sounds of the water and the occasional bird. I set up camp, got a fire going, and spent the rest of the afternoon just relaxing. I cooked some food over the fire, read for a while, and as the sun started to set, I felt more relaxed than I had in weeks. By the time night fell, the forest was completely still. The only sound was the soft crackle of the fire and the creek flowing nearby. I didn't feel uneasy or anything, just calm. I turned in for the night around 10, lying in my tent with my sleeping bag zipped up, listening to the peaceful sounds outside. It took me a while to fall asleep, but eventually I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night I woke up. At first I wasn't sure why. Everything seemed quiet, no weird noises or anything like that. But then I heard it, a faint rustling sound outside my tent, like something or someone moving around. I figured it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or deer. I wasn't too concerned, but I grabbed my flashlight just in case. I listened for a minute, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. I stayed awake for a little while, listening, but when I didn't hear anything else, I turned over and tried to fall back asleep. But then, just as I was starting to drift off again, I heard something else. This time, it was closer. A soft, deliberate noise, like the sound of a zipper being pulled open, slowly. I froze. My tent zipper wasn't being opened, but someone or something was out there, and it was close. I grabbed my knife, which I always keep next to me when I'm camping, and just lay there, listening. The sound continued for another second or two, then stopped. My heart was racing, but I didn't move. I didn't want to make any noise or let whoever was out there know I was awake. After a minute, everything went quiet again. I stayed completely still, gripping my knife, straining to hear if there was any more movement. Then, just when I thought it might have been my imagination, I heard another sound. This time it was even closer, just outside the tent. It wasn't the sound of an animal or the wind. It was someone, moving quietly but not quietly enough. They were right outside, standing there. I didn't move. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and fast. I wasn't sure what to do. If I unzipped the tent and stepped out, I'd be exposing myself, but staying in the tent felt worse. I stayed frozen, listening, trying to calm down and think clearly. A few minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and then slowly I heard the footsteps again. Whoever it was started moving away from the tent, heading back into the woods. The steps were soft but unmistakable. I waited, listening until they faded completely into the distance. I stayed awake for the rest of the night,
clutching my knife and staring at the tent flap, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, dawn broke, and the faint light of morning started to filter through the tent. When the sun was up, I finally felt like I could move. I slowly unzipped the tent and stepped outside, half expecting to find something, footprints or some sign of whoever had been there, but there was nothing. The campsite looked exactly as I had left it. The fire pit was cold and my gear was untouched. I checked the ground around the tent, but I couldn't see any footprints. Maybe the ground had been too hard, or maybe they'd been careful to avoid leaving any traces.
I tried to brush it off as my mind playing tricks on me, maybe imagining things in the dark. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, right outside my tent, watching me while I slept. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but I convinced myself that I was being paranoid. It was probably just an animal, I told myself, and I was overreacting. I decided to stick it out for one more night, figuring I'd leave early the next morning. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I went for a hike, spent some time fishing, and tried to enjoy myself, but I couldn't relax. I kept thinking about the noises from the night before. As the day wore on, I became more and more on edge. Every little sound in the forest made me jump, and by the time the sun started to set, I was already dreading the night ahead. I built up the fire bigger than I had the night before, hoping it would help keep anything or anyone away. I sat by the fire for a while, eating dinner and trying to focus on my book, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Around 10, I finally crawled back into the tent, but I didn't bother getting into my sleeping bag. I lay there, fully dressed, with my knife next to me, listening to the fire crackle outside. I told myself that if I heard anything again, I'd get up, grab my gear, and leave. I wasn't going to spend another night lying there in fear, waiting for something to happen. A few hours passed, and I was starting to think I'd gotten worked up over nothing. But then, just as I was beginning to relax, I heard it again. The soft, slow sound of something moving outside the tent. This time, there was no mistaking it. It wasn't an animal. It was the same deliberate, cautious movement I'd heard the night before. Someone was out there, walking around my campsite. I lay there, frozen, listening. The footsteps moved closer, circling the tent. I could hear the leaves crunching underfoot, and my heart started pounding in my chest. Whoever it was, they were taking their time, moving slowly, like they were trying not to make too much noise. I didn't dare move. I kept my hand on the knife, ready to defend myself if I had to, but I didn't want to provoke anything. The steps circled the tent again, coming closer each time. I could hear them clearly now, right outside the thin fabric. I held my breath, waiting. Then, just like the night before, the footsteps stopped. There was a long, tense silence, and I could feel the weight of someone's presence just outside. They were standing there, listening, maybe waiting for me to move. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually, I heard the footsteps again, moving away from the tent and back into the woods. I didn't dare move for a long time, just listening, waiting for them to come back. But they didn't. After what felt like an eternity, I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim glow over the clearing. There was no one there. I packed up my gear in record time, barely bothering to check my surroundings. I didn't care about breakfast or leaving the campsite tidy. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. I hiked back to the trailhead in the early morning light, my nerves on edge the whole way. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes sent my heart racing, but I didn't see anyone. The forest was empty. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the trunk and got the hell out of there. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see someone standing on the edge of the road watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out behind me. I haven't been camping alone since. I still go out into the woods, but always with friends or in more populated areas.
I don't know what it was about that trip that went so wrong, but I'm not willing to take any more chances. Something, or someone, was out there, and I'm not about to put myself in that situation again.
Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.